You shall count for yourselves, again, from that day, from the day that follows the Shabbat, miyom haviachem es Omer hatznufa, from the day when you brought the Omer, that amount of barley that was waved, Sheva Shabbatot timimot tiyana. 7 Shabbatot, 7 weeks, right? Ad mimacharas hashavas hashvias, excuse me, until the macharas hashavas hashvias, until you count through all 7 of those. Tisperu chamishim yom, you will have achieved 50 days. V'hikravtem mincha chadashal Hashem, and then you will bring a second karban, a karban mincha, another karban from grain. So what do we have? We have Pesach and we have Shavuos. When does Omer, Sviras Omer begin? It's a counting that parallels the karban Omer. It begins with the karban Omer and it ends when you get to Shavuot. 50 days later, you bring another karban and that's the end of the count. That's day 50. So, Mimacharas HaShabbos, right? That's obviously the ambiguity here. What does it mean the day after Shabbos? Right? We know we start counting Sviras Omer on the second day of Pesach, and the Torah doesn't exactly tell us when it is. Okay. If you fast forward to the book of Devarim, the 5th book of the Torah, they're talking about the holidays of the year. Most of the holidays of the year, by the way, are found either in this week's Parsha, in Parshas Emor, or in Parshas Re'eh, which is Devarim chapter 16. So there again, the Torah doesn't just reiterate Pesach and Shavuos, but the Torah also reiterates the counting of the Omer between them. We mentioned before the Ramban's approach. On Pesach you have the first days and the last days and Chol Hamoed in between. The Ramban looks at the Pesach Shavuos time of the year as one big holiday. Pesach is the first day, Shavuos is the end days, and Sviras Omer is the Chol Hamoed in between. So here you have the 7 weeks brought up again. Shiva Shavuos Tisbar Lach, this is Pasuk Tes, verse 9. You should count 7 weeks. Mehachel Chermesh Bakamat Hachel Iswar Shiva Shavuos. Here you get a little bit more detail from when the sickle is first put to the standing crop. You shall begin counting 7 weeks from when you first start to harvest. V'asisa, then verse 10, Chag Shavuos, you should make the festival of Shavuos, Lashem Elokecha, Misas Nivas Yadcha Asher Titain, the voluntary offerings that you should give should be commensurate with how much Hashem, your God, gives you, Kasher Yivracha Hashem Elokecha. Okay. The one striking difference, well, there's more than one, but one striking difference between these two passages in the Torah, the one that describes Omer in our Parsha, and the one that describes Omer in Parshas Re'eh, is how we describe the count. In our Parsha this week, it's described as Shabbos, Shabbos, Shabbos. I bolded all of them, I think. You bring the karban Omer mimacharas HaShabbos, and then you start counting from mimacharas HaShabbos. And how much do you count? You count 7 Shabbatot, right? Until the macharas HaShabbos Hashvias, until you get to Shavuos, and then you're done. And there's no mention of Shabbat in the second paragraph. Shiva Shavuos Tisparlach. You should count 7 Shavuos. You should count weeks. Chag Shavuos, a holiday of weeks, not Shabbatot. So the question I would like to ask today is, why does the Torah describe the 7 weeks as 7 Shabbatot? Why is the first day the karban brought, the second day of Pesach, referred to the day that follows Shabbat? Now, the more famous component of this discussion is that the Talmud tells us that you have these Tzedukim and the Baitusim, which were 2 groups that did not believe in the oral traditions of the Torah. They believed that the Torah was itself divine and that it came from God, but that's as far as it went. All the rabbinic stuff that was made up, that was for other reasons. You didn't have to buy into it if you didn't want to. So there were these 2 people, Tzadok and Baisus, and they each had followers. They were known as Tzedukim and Baitusim. So the Baitusim were always really opposed to the traditional rabbinic approach, and one of the things that was always a major issue was the counting of the Omer. And it results from the ambiguity in these psukim. And the Gemara in Menachos goes through a whole list of all the reasons why the rabbis disliked the reading of the Baitusim and the tradition that we had that Macharas HaShabbos means the day after Pesach. So, obviously, if you say Mimacharas HaShabbos, the day after Shabbos, which is another way of saying Sunday, and that was the approach of the Baitusim, so then the question would be, which Sunday? Yeah, right? Okay, fine. So the Baitusim don't like our approach. They don't like saying it's the day after Pesach. So they say Mimacharas Shabbos Bereshis, when was the world first created, what day of the week, what day in the calendar was the first Shabbat ever, and then maybe the Sunday after that, and how does this connect to, how do you get to Shavuos after that, and what does that have to do with Chag HaKatzir, the time that you're harvesting? So there were holes in their argument. Then the Gemara goes on to prove how we know Rosh Hashanah is Sunday. But the point that the Gemara doesn't address, and this is what I was reading about in the Haggadah of Rav Sorotzkin, is why does the Torah choose to do this? Okay, I get it. Shabbat here in this context has to mean Pesach, right? So if Shabbat means the first day of Pesach, Rosh Hashanah means the second day of Pesach. But that doesn't explain why the Torah does this, and the Gemara does not address that question. The Gemara proves that Shabbat does not, Rosh Hashanah does not mean Sunday, and it does mean the second day of Pesach. It doesn't tell us why the Torah chooses to write it in such a way. So that's the question I would like to pose tonight. Why is Sfiras Omer all about Shabbat? So, to further this discussion, is there a mitzvah to count Sfiras Omer this year? So everyone says, well, we're counting Sfiras Omer, so there must be, right? So that is a major debate that occurred in the Middle Ages as to whether there is a mitzvah to count the Omer when there is no Karban Omer, right? Because the whole, remember, Sfiras Omer, you could just say, is the counting for the Karban Omer. If you have a Karban Omer on Pesach and you have a Shtei HaLechem on Shavuot, so you count from one to the other, you get 50 days. That makes sense. What if you don't have the Karbanos, which we don't? So then there's really no reason to count. Now, the opinion that is most associated with saying that is not true is Maimonides. The Rambam in source 3 tells us in his code of law, which was written many, many years after the destruction of all the temples and there were no karbanos, and he tells us you should know there's a mitzvah to count Sfiras Omer. Mitzvahs aseh lispor shiva shavuos timimos miyom havas ha'omer. We count 7 Shabbosos, 7 weeks, complete weeks from the day the Omer was brought. Shneimar v'shvartem lachamim afarasach Shabbos shava Shabbatot. Because the Torah tells us you count from the day after the first day of Pesach 7 weeks. Umitzvah limnos hayamim im hashvuos, and you count the days and the weeks, which is our tradition. Shneimar tisperu chamishim yom, because it says you count the 7 weeks and you count the 50 days. So that means we count both weeks and days. Umitchilas hayom monim, and we try and count from the beginning of the day, meaning lefikach mona balayla. That's why we count at night, because we want to get a full one, a full day in there. Shisha Asar b'Nisan, from the eve of the 16th of Nisan. The Torah describes it as 7 complete weeks, so we try and count them in their complete form. Count as early as possible in the day, so you've done a count for the entire 24-hour period. Does the Rambam mention anything about Svira not being a mitzvah nowadays? Does he say we really don't have to, but we do it because X, Y, and Z, it's traditional, so we stick to it? No, he just says there's a mitzvah. And he never says anything to the contrary. Most of the Rishonim, most of the other commentaries from the medieval period all disagree. And they think that there's no mitzvah, biblically speaking, to count anymore. Ooh, question?
No, I was going to say that even though it's Sfirat HaOmer and we know the Omer is the Korban, there still has to be some like connection to the counting from Pesach to receiving the Torah. Like it was the Omer not a remembrance of Matan Torah?
So what's very interesting, first of all, Shavuot in the Torah has nothing to do with Kabbalas Torah, right? The holiday of Shavuot in the Torah is all about harvesting. That's first of all. Second of all, what generates, this is the halachic, the legal question would be, what generates the mitzvah of Sfirat HaOmer? Is counting the Omer itself an independent mitzvah? Or is counting the Omer a mitzvah because we're doing step A and we're doing step B and we need to know how long to wait? That's what this debate kind of hinges on in terms of the legal logic to it, right? There's a similar debate within Sfiras HaOmer about whether you have each day is its own mitzvah or whether there's a mitzvah to count the entire thing. That's where this notion comes from. If you miss a day, then you shouldn't count with the bracha anymore. Why? Because it's all a process. If you're missing components of the process, so then there's no mitzvah, or there's definitely no mitzvah with a bracha. So because there are different opinions on that issue, so we choose to continue counting, but we count without making the blessing anymore. This is the tension within Sfiras Omer. Rabbi Soloveitchik talked about this. What generates the obligation to count? Is it the Karban that generates it? Is the period of time itself that generates it? But Sfiras HaOmer in the modern era has taken on this literature of building towards something, building towards the receiving of the Torah. And that's what I want to try and get to. If Sfiras Omer is not about the Karban nowadays, why are we doing it? So Rambam says this whole discussion is mute, right? Because we count, the Torah tells us to count, we count whether there's a Karban or not. However, Tosos in source 4 is one that is cited for the opinion that Sfiras Omer is no longer biblically required, it's only rabbinic. Now, his question here is, and it's interesting, this question comes up, historically it came up because people in Shul's davened Maariv before it was dark. I heard Rabbi Weber from Clanton Park made a very interesting point last night. The Gemara in Chagiga tells us that there are certain signs, certain behaviors a person can do that will let us know that the person is mentally ill. And that has legal ramifications. One of the criteria for determining if someone is mentally ill is if they wander alone at night. If they walk the streets after it's dark. That's what the Gemara says. They didn't have street lights, it wasn't safe. If you're just wandering around carelessly, something's not right. So they didn't daven Maariv. They didn't come out to Shul at 9:15 or 9:30 to daven Maariv. That was dangerous. So what did they do? They davened Mincha late, and then they kind of put in Maariv, and then they ran home before it got dark. That was traditional for a very long time. And the question came up, what do you do about Sfiras Omer? You're supposed to count Sfira the first possible chance you have at night, but people are going to go home and they're going to forget. So they wanted to count in Shul when they davened Maariv. But they were really davening Maariv too early. They were davening Maariv before sunset because they really wanted to daven with the minyan. So they davened early. But Sfiras Omer, maybe they should count later. Maybe what happens if you count too early? Do you have to count again? That's the issue that Tosos is grappling with here. So he says it appears that if it's questionably nighttime, one may make the blessing and not have to wait until it's definitely night, since this is a rabbinic and bold question. This is a Sveika D'Rabbanan. If you're not sure if it's daytime or if it's nighttime and it's kind of close, should you count Sfira or should you not count Sfira? He says, what's the difference? Count. Why? Because we're not doing Sfira that the Torah commanded anyway. We're doing this because the rabbis kind of encouraged us to continue the tradition of counting Sfira. So Omer. So if it's only a rabbinic commandment and you're not so sure, that's fine. If it was biblical, you would have to wait till it was absolutely nighttime. You could see the stars, no question about it. You're going to get every biblical mitzvah perfect. But a suffix, D'Rabbanan, don't have to worry about it. And then he goes on to say maybe it might even be better to do it earlier. He rejects that. Maybe it's better to do it even earlier because we're trying to get complete days. So better to get 24 hours and 5 minutes than 23 hours and 55 minutes. But then he says that's not true. And then he mentions at the end where one forgets to count at night, the Bahag stated to count at day, which isn't so obvious. Not everyone agreed to that. Is a mitzvah only to count at night, or if you miss it, can you count again in the morning? So here you have Tosos heading the approach that if you're not bringing a Karban Omer, if you're not bringing the sacrifice of Pesach or Shavuos, there's no mitzvah from the Torah to count Sfiras HaOmer. This is a very interesting debate. So we're counting Sfiras HaOmer anyway, right? Which opinion do we follow? We do not follow the opinion of the Rambam. We assume that there is no mitzvah from the Torah to count Sfira if there is no Karban. Do we treat this as a biblical mitzvah or as a rabbinic mitzvah? Sfiras Omer nowadays is treated as a rabbinical mitzvah, with all of the consequences that come along with it. Now, what's interesting is if this is a biblical mitzvah, then people have different traditions about what they say when they do Sfiras Omer. They have longer versions and shorter versions, right? Certain people, I don't know what the minhag is here in the Shul, have the tradition of saying Hineni Muchanu Mezuman, right? I am preparing myself, L'kayim, what's the phrase? L'kayim mitzvahs aseh shel Sfiras Omer. What does the phrase mitzvahs aseh shel Sfiras Omer mean? Mitzvahs aseh is a positive commandment, as opposed to a mitzvahs lo aseh, which is a negative commandment, right? The Torah says, do the following, don't do other things, right? Positive commandments and negative commandments, right? That terminology, positive and negative commandment, is only used to describe biblical commandments. The rabbis tell you to do things. We don't distinguish between the rabbis told you to do something positive and something negative. It's when God tells you to do things. Some things are mitzvahs aseh and some are lo aseh. The implication of that phrase is very problematic. To say Hineni Muchan Zum L'kayim mitzvahs aseh, if it's not a mitzvahs aseh, this is a rabbinic commandment. So you'll find that in some of the more recent halachic literature, they pose this question. They say, how can you say mitzvah saseh if it's not really mitzvah saseh? Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, I believe, was of the opinion that if it's in the siddur, you shouldn't ask questions. Which I thought was a very insightful answer. He said, that's tradition, that's what we say. Others have said to take it out. Some people don't have the tradition of saying that phrase for other reasons. It's more of maybe a Hasidic minhag than the Misnagdic minhag, so not everybody says it. But either way, that becomes problematic because we don't follow the opinion of the Rambam. Because there is no biblical mitzvah to continue counting Sfiras HaOmer. We count it anyway. Why do we count? So the most common approach, the approach that the Gemara takes, is what we call Zecher HaMikdash. That we try and do things that were done in the Beis HaMikdash, in the temple, even though we don't have a temple, right? We want to remember what it was like to live in Israel, what it was like to have a temple and to have that kind of worship. So we practice things that were done in the temple, outside of Israel, wherever we are in the world. A classic example of that is, anybody? Lulav. What's the mitzvah to take a lulav? How many days do you take a lulav for? 7 days. What does the Torah say? How many days does the Torah say that you should take a lulav on Sukkot? 2. Ulchaftem lachem, you should take for yourselves Bayom Harishon. On the first day. Pri-Eitz Hadar, Kapos Tamarim, and Esro, Lulav, Hadasim, and Arabos. Where did they take the lulav all 7 days of Sukkot to Shul? Only in the Beis HaMikdash. If you weren't in Jerusalem for Sukkot, you took a lulav on the first day, and then there goes your $80, right? Or whatever they sell it for here, I don't know, right? That's it, right? And by the way, so all biblical mitzvah versus non-biblical mitzvah. So on the first day of Sukkot, if you have a problem with your lulav, if it's a little bit bent, if your esrog has a spot, you want to make a bracha on that? Probably not. Ask the rabbi. Find your better one. Second day of Sukkot? Not such a big deal. When my wife and I first got married, we spent our first Sukkot with my in-laws. So my mother-in-law said, don't buy a lulav wherever you are and then fly with it. That's risky, right? So we'll just order one here. So I said to her, how much are they selling them for? And they have the really expensive sets and the mediocre sets and then the really cheap sets. So I said to her, buy me the cheapest one possible. So she's like, I'll buy you a real lulav. You don't have to buy the cheapest one. So I said to her, no. The first day of Sukkot that year was Shabbos, right? You can't take a lulav on Shabbos. So there's no fulfillment of the biblical mitzvah. So there's a rabbinic mitzvah that you should take a lulav. So to spend the most ridiculous amount of money on it, not everyone will agree with me, but a lot of people believe this. To spend all this money just so that we can do something that looks like a lulav. If it's not kosher, you could still use it to a certain extent. That's just one example of the same principle. So we were so accustomed to, everyone takes a lulav 7 days, but the truth is, there's only a mitzvah to take it 1 day. But to remember what happened in the Beis, now all we think is what happened in the Beis HaMikdash. I guess we're a little confused, but to remember what the procedure was in the Beis HaMikdash, we take it 7 days to commemorate the procedure. So, what did they do in the times of the Beis HaMikdash? Well, they brought a karban Omer on Pesach, and they brought a shtei halechem on Shavuos, and they counted 50 days in between. So they counted, we count. We can't bring the karban, at least we'll do the sphira. That seems to be the most simple explanation of what was going on. But tonight I want to go back to our original question and pose an alternative. Why are the weeks of sphira called Shabbatot, not Shavuot, at certain times? And why is the first day of the Omer called the day after Shabbat? So Rav Sorotskin's approach in the Haggadah is very interesting. He says, think about the mindset of the Jew in Egypt. He's really not the most religious of people. He doesn't go to Shul. We talked about this a lot when we went through Sefer Shemos. He doesn't go to Shul. He doesn't learn Torah. What does he have? He dresses like a Jew. He talks like a Jew. Right? God says to this person, I have an idea. Moshe is going to come down, Moshe Rabbeinu, and he's going to encourage you to go to the desert with no food, and you're going to worship me. And you're going to like it, and it's going to be great. And what do they all say? Absolutely, let's go. And they run out into the desert. What do we hear months later and years later in the desert? What are the Jewish people constantly saying? This is terrible. We remember what it was like in Egypt. Things were great, right? And we always think, how rude. But ask the question in the reverse. What were they thinking to start? They had homes, they had food, they had jobs. It wasn't great. You're going to go out, but you go out into the desert, you're going to die. You're going to try and take an entire nation through the desert, across the sea, and with nothing. And do you hear a peep out of them? No. They're all ready to go. What happens? What Zirkind says is a very fascinating idea. He says, and this is also interesting, he makes a point, you can talk about someone who was practicing religion, who leaves religion, and then they want to come back to religion as a Baal Tshuva. Right? What's the term for someone that never knew they were Jewish, that never knew what Judaism was all about, and then they decide they want to get interested? Is that a Baal Tshuva? He says they're not really about Tshuva. Tshuva is to shav, is to return. To return to what? You were never there. He said a very strange expression. And he says the Jew in Egypt was kind of like asking the person who's never even known they were Jewish to do tshuva. God says to them, take for yourselves a Karban Pesach, take the Avodah Zarah, the idolatry of the land that you're living in, and slaughter it, and initiate yourselves into our nation, and then we're going to go out into the desert. And the way that God does this, he claims, is by coming down that night. If you look in the Haggadah very carefully, when God comes down to kill the firstborns of the Egyptians, the Haggadah says, Ani v'lo malach, I myself, and not an angel. Ani v'lo sarf, me. God came down himself. This miracle, there was no one else involved. God did it, right? But the Haggadah says there were two functions to God coming down. The first function was to perform this punishment, this plague against the Egyptians, and the second one was to arouse the souls of the Jewish people. On the night of the Seder, God comes down and he kind of slaps you across the face and he wakes you up and he says, where have you been all this time? And he says, what is the term that best describes that event? The night of Pesach, when the Jew who really had no idea, he knew who Moshe Rabbeinu was by now, but he had no idea who God was. And God walks into Egypt and he wakes them up and he says, you have a mission, you have a mitzvah, we're coming together, we're going to go. He says the best term to describe that is Shabbat. The Gemara says, what is Shabbat? It's Me'in Olam Haba. Shabbat is the one day of the week where we can experience what goes on in heaven to a certain extent. The most spiritual day of the week. And he says the Shabbos par excellence, if you will, was the night of the Seder. Because that night, the night when the Jewish people did their first mitzvah, when they took their Karban Pesach and they slaughtered the idolatry of the Egyptians, God walked into their house. It wasn't us going up there. God came down to us. And it was this unbelievable awakening. Unbelievable awakening. Jewish people thought to themselves, they didn't say, look how far I've come from because they didn't have that past. But they looked at themselves in the mirror and they said, we have tremendous potential and we haven't even been using it. And they saw at the night of the Seder how much they could achieve, and they were so confident in that mission they had no doubts at all. That's what Zirkind suggests. What happens the next day? You wake up the next morning and you find yourself in the desert sandwiched between the sea and the Egyptians, right? And where is God? He's back in heaven. It's not the Seder night anymore. And you realize, or you think, you made a terrible mistake. And he says, that's exactly what happened. And they ask God, where are you? And he says, now you have to meet me upstairs. And that is what the Torah describes as Mimachras HaShabbos, the day that followed Shabbos. The transition from that perfectly clear and confident mission of Judaism to the fear of death with God's absence, or the normal way in which we live a spiritual life in a physical world. That is the day that followed. He says that the Karban Omer is actually brought from barley, which the Gemara describes, the Talmud describes as the food of animals. Wheat is the Talmud says is symbolic of the food of human beings, and barley is the food of animals. And he says on the night of the Seder, they wouldn't eat barley. These were kings. These were the friends of God. This was Pesach night. But the next day they eat Sa'orim. They feel like they're nothing. They feel like they're such physical creatures. They don't have the same inspiration that they had the night before. So what does God say? So God says to them, you have to do it yourself. If you want that experience, if you want that confidence, if you want that security, you can't count on me every day of the week. Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Exodus, was a rare experience when the Jew experienced heaven on earth, when they experienced the ultimate Shabbat, if you will. But Mimacharat HaShabbat is the day after. The day when you wake up and you realize if you want that kind of relationship with God, it's going to have to come from you and not from Him. And here, credit to Rabbi Greenberg, the Rosh Yeshiva in Kerem B'Yavneh, for in his Sefer, for pointing to this unbelievable source. We asked the question, so why are we counting Sfira? Is it just because they used to count it in the temple and now there's no point? So he suggests that that's not true. And he gives an alternative suggestion which maybe fits the themes of Omer that we're used to. If you look in source 6, this is the Ran in his commentary to the Talmud in Psachim. Bahagara Gam Kain Amru. This is what they taught. Bishasha Amar Lahem Moshe. When Moshe turned to the people in Egypt and he says, Ta'avdun Esar Elokim al Har Hazeh. We're going to go out to the desert and we're going to go to Har Sinai and we're going to worship God. Amru Lo Yisrael. What did the Jewish people say? Moshe Rabbeinu. E Masai Avodazu. They said, okay, that's great. They're excited. When is it? Amar Lahem L'sof Chamishim Yom. Moshe said, we'll be there in 50 days. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? 50 days, right? Moshe says that's how long it's going to be, 7 full weeks. So what did the people do? They drew up their own calendars. Each of them said on that day, they said, this is unbelievable. 50 days to go. This is day 1 until we get there. This is day 2 of the 50 days. This is 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. They counted. It was their own decision. Mikan. Therefore, kavu chachamim l'sfiras ha'omer. In the bold, kolomar. In other words, bisman hazeh, in our day, she'ein anu mevi'im karban, v'lo omer, ela mechashben nun yom l'simchas haTorah kemo shemanu Yisrael ba'oso zman. Just like the Jewish people said, we can't wait for Har Sinai, we're going to count 50 days. There was no karban omer. There was no temple. These were Jews in Egypt. And they were so excited that they picked up this mitzvah. So that's what we're doing. We don't have the Omer that brings us from Karban A to Karban B, but we do have the Omer that was the inspiration of the Machras HaShabbos, of that day after Pesach when they really wanted it. They needed something to hold on to. And they were so excited about Har Sinai that they gave themselves a way to keep track of that process. In terms of this discussion, the Ran then goes on to say, you see from here that this statement of the Medrash, that Sfiras Omer again is not a biblical mitzvah nowadays. Because the Chachamim said, just like they did that in Egypt, so we do that again. In other words, the biblical mitzvah has fallen away because there's no karban, but we still have a mitzvah to do it, to remember how the Jews did it in Egypt. So I think it's interesting, because biblically we associate Sfiras Omer with the karban, and then we do it anyway, either because you don't really need the karban according to Maimonides, or according to the other opinions, to remember what happened at the temple. But the Ran's Medrash, what he's trying to say is that before there was an Omer, before there was a holiday of Pesach and there were sacrifices on Shavuos, there already was Sfiras Omer. Because Mimachras HaShabbos, the day that followed that revelation in Egypt, at the night of the Seder, that's when the people started taking their own initiative. If you go back to source 5, the Medrash in Vayikra, Reb Chia said the following: the weeks are described as Sheva Shabbatot in bold Timimot Tiyana. 7 Shabbatot they shall be complete. So he says, Emasai Hein Timimos. What does it mean? When are the weeks complete? Bisman She Yisrael Osen Risono Shel Makom. When the Jewish people are doing the will of God. And he says, quoting the Ger Rebbe, I believe, that, what does that mean? There are 2 kinds of Sfiras HaOmer. That's what the approach Rabbi Greenberg took. There's the Sfiras HaOmer that says, I have a karban on Pesach and I have a karban on Shavuos, and I have to count from one to the other. I have to know when it's going to be. I need a calendar, so that's a mitzvah. Why is it a mitzvah? Because God told me to. And the Jews of Mitzrayim were challenged in a different way. They weren't given a mitzvah. They weren't told how to experience their relationship with God, and they improvised. And Rav Greenberg suggests that that's what Timimos is all about. Counting on yourself. Sheva Shabbasos Timimos means it's not enough to say that there's a mitzvah to count because God told me to. But to say I want to count because there's something I'm looking forward to. Even if there's no Omer, which is really beautiful about what the Ran is saying. There's no Omer. There's no obligation to count anymore. But if you look back in history, we didn't start counting because there was an obligation. We started counting because we were excited. We started counting because we had something to look forward to. Shabbos was easy. The first night of Pesach was a very easy experience for the Jewish people, as easy as it could be. You take the korban, that was risky, and from that point on, you were initiated into the Jewish people. You had that faith. You talk about the matzah, the Zohar describes as called the bread of faith, because that's what it took to get them out of Egypt. It took faith. But at the night of the Seder, faith was easy. When you see a clear distinction between those that are following God and those that aren't following God, God's presence is almost tangible. Not like the smoke in the Ten Commandments movie. That's not realistic, right? I assume that's not realistic, right? But they could almost feel God's presence. And the next day God was gone and they took the initiative to find him. And even if Sfiras HaOmer, even if there is no, it's fine, we call it Sfiras HaOmer. We're counting, but there's no Omer. And maybe that makes it that much more special. We want there to be an Omer. We want to fulfill the biblical commandment to count the Sfira as well. But we shouldn't look at this mitzvah and say, well, it's not really that important anymore. When you look back at the history of it, you see that it was never really, to a certain extent, it didn't start off being about the Omer. It really started out about finding their own people's own experience. Rav Sorotzkin suggests one final piece to this, which is interesting to think about, but he says, why is it that we count days and we count weeks? And he wants to suggest, which I think is food for thought, but he says there are different kinds of Jews. And there are some Jews who are so connected, who are so involved, who are so inspired, that every Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday is a Shabbos. Every day of the Omer is an easy day for them, because they're in Shul, and they're up for learning, and they're pumped, right? So that, he says, that Jew counts Sfira every day. But what if you're not that Jew? It's not easy. That's the message here. The message is that it's hard to find God, and it's easy to lose faith when God is far away. Or at least when God feels like he's far away. So he says the message of the Shabbatot, to finish up his piece, is even when if you can't hack it for 50 days, you can hack it for 7. And he says for some people, they're at work, and they're with their families, and they're busy, and they're rushing, and they're stressed. And the week is not the way they want it to go. So he says you can't get Chamishim Yom. You can try to get the 50 days. You might not get every single one of them. But Sheva Shabbasos Timimos Tiyena. There should also be 7 Shabbatot. We're looking to build our relationship with God. We're looking to earn our acceptance of Torah, not to have it handed to us like it was in Mitzrayim. We're looking to build towards something that's long-lasting and that's meaningful. And for some Jews, that's something that they can work on every day, and for some Jews, it's only something they can do on Shabbos. Everyone has their own way of achieving it, but everyone has to find a way to do it. Sfiras HaOmer is about the korban. It's about that mitzvah, and there's more to say about the korban Omer, and there's more to say about the korbanos that are brought in Shavuos, and maybe how those korbanos kind of hint to Kabbalas HaTorah. That's a different topic. But even without the korban, we have our own mission. Every person has their own individual mission. For some people, they're challenged every day. For some people, they're only challenged one day a week. Everyone's job, everyone's challenges are very different. But if we continue to count in our own way, if we count the days, if we count the weeks, if we look to find Shabbatot, if we look to find opportunities for spirituality, for some people that's a parsha shir, for some people that's a panel discussion on organ donation, for other people that's Tehillim, it's davening and shul. Everyone has their own way. There are different paths to getting there. But the point that the Ran is making here is that it's not about the way you go, it's about taking the initiative to actually make that happen. And every person does it their own way. But however you do it, you have to take the initiative.